Take it away.
All right. Well, hi, I am Carly Ho. Welcome to Consuming APIs for Fun and Profit. Disclaimer, I'm not going to tell you how to profit from this. Actually, you'll have to come up with that yourself because I have all my best ideas reserved. So my name, as I said, is Carly Ho. I'm a senior engineer at Click Studios, which is where you are right now. You can follow me on Twitter at CarlyMHo and find me at a variety of other lovely places on the internet. So, to start out with, what is an API? Who here has done work with APIs before? Or at least knows that they have? Okay, so a decent number of people. So API stands for Application Programming Interface, which is basically a way for you to programmatically retrieve data for display or transformation from any kind of website that decides to make their API publicly available. So you may have interacted with API, well, we've almost certainly interacted with APIs on a daily basis, whether you know it or not. If, for example, you're using a service like If This Then That, that's basically a service that is intended to connect multiple different kinds of APIs together and transform the result. Same with Zapier, which is also a service that will sort of do this for you. And basically, like, you know, if this event happens on, if we get this information from an API, then we send it on to this person, that sort of thing. So usually when you have an API, it's accessed with what is called an endpoint URL. So there is some kind of address that you can put in a browser, they can point like a browser or a request to, and it'll retrieve the data and return it to you in some format. And this can happen in a variety of ways. Some APIs require you to make a post request and have some kind of credentials. Others, you can just freely access it with a regular GET request. So you can just type the URL into your browser and see it spit out a bunch of data that's in a nigh unreadable format that you have to do something with. The data is usually, not always, but usually returned in JSON format, which I will get into a little bit later. But basically, it's a more or less standardized format to be able to return some data that most programming languages have a way to process in their own implementation of like a parser. So how do we work with API data? So since this is PHP user group, in PHP we have the function file_get_contents and also the native set of curl curl functions. Curl is short for client URL. I think it's the oldest implementation of being able to grab data from another website or endpoint. In general, file_get_contents is easier to use, so I'm going to be demoing that today. We can also use JavaScript in any page that you can embed JavaScript in to perform API calls on particular browser events and fetch that data asynchronously. So for example, if you have a bunch of blog posts and you're displaying, like, say 10 on a page, and when someone gets to the bottom, you want them to be able to click a button that says load more and just pop more onto the page without them having to go to another URL. That would be a great use case for hitting an API built into your backend to get those posts. So that's a sort of use case for having an API on your own site that you use. So a word of warning. So there's a little bit of danger inherent into getting data from a third party. Specifically, if you're getting data from a server that is not one that you own, sometimes it's possible that that server might be compromised and you might not know it, and the people who own that server may not know it, or someone on that side might be malicious or whatnot. So, as a word of warning, if you're doing anything, especially in production, or that you're letting other people use, sanitize your data like you would your form inputs. In PHP, wrap those puppies in HTML special chars and add slashes and that sort of thing. So first of all, we're going to talk about using existing APIs. So if you don't have an API yourself, but you want to access data from some service online, so there's a lot of places that will let you grab data and, like, say, display it on your site if you want to, say, like, show what books you've been reading recently on like Goodreads or something like that to people visiting your website. So, as I mentioned before, a really easy function to use is file get contents. At the most basic form, you first argument and only argument you absolutely need is a URL. This can be relative, or it can be like prefixed with HTTP or HTTPS pointing to a different server. And that, which if you return it to a variable, will fetch the contents for you. So if you are pointing that to, say, API endpoint, usually that'll return a chunk of JSON data. If you are pointing it to like a normal website, it'll just return all the HTML that site spits out in a string. And there are other things that you can do with that are also interesting, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So it will be a string rather than any kind of object that we can use. So it'll just be like, if you try and say like iterate over this object, it'll be like, I can't iterate over that. That's a big string. I don't know what to do with this. So there are some other things that we need to do before we can make that data that we're getting back useful. So JSON, which expanded means JavaScript object notation, is a format that, as I said, most API data is returned to these days. When we use JavaScript to fetch API data, usually it can figure out what that is right away because it's like, oh, I know what this is. It's just a big like JavaScript object. But in PHP, when we if we're using file get contents or CURL, we need to parse it. And parsing it is basically as easy as putting the string output into the first argument of JSON decode, with the second argument being true. Usually you don't want to, like in this case, you wouldn't want to set that to false, but there are some use cases for that. And that will return that as a big old JSON object. So, and then in that case, you will have something that in PHP it'll be able to be detectable as PHP array. You can iterate over multiple items, access members using arrow notation, that sort of thing. So super nice, makes it really easy to use. Another thing to note when you are using third-party APIs is that it might tell you need a key or a key and a token pair to use it. So API keys are usually unique to like an account. Like say if you sign up with, like to use my example previously, Goodreads or something like Trello, there will usually be an API key associated with your account that basically lets the service know who you are in order to determine what permissions you have to be able to display content. So for example, if you were trying to fetch the profile data of anyone on, like say Trello, where some of the information is public and some is private, anyone would be able to return the profile data of any person without needing to have like an API key probably. But if you wanted to return like a list of what boards each person has, then you would need a token and it would only show you yours, because you don't want to have like secret data exposed to other people who might be like, oh, well that's a bunch of like really great secrets. Has anyone heard about like people storing like production passwords in Trello boards? Because that was a thing that happened and was so basically for security or account privilege purposes, or to be able to determine how many API calls you've made, if there's like a pricing thing involved, like how Google limits the number of calls you can make on their free tier for Google Maps. And then your token, you don't always need a token, but it's generally application specific. So if you have like a key, you also need to generate a token for a developer application that you're using, just for identification purposes, and so that the site can know which application is doing what. So when you are using a key and a token on your request to an API, if you're using file get contents, for example, there's a context parameter that you can insert options into. And so what you're going to be using is the headers. Headers are the data set at the beginning of an HTTP request that tells your browser what to expect. So if you're loading a normal web page, usually it'll load the content type, which will be like some kind of HTML format, whether that's XHTML or HTML 4.0 or whatnot. So in this case, we are telling it that the method is post, which tells it how to process the data sent to it, and that the header that we want to send with this, which is usually something colon value. So it's the key, the key, which is also the word key. That was a really weird sentence to formulate. And a API key that I just made up, which is actually just me smashing the home row, which will not in fact work on example.com, but you get my meaning. So you insert that into stream context create, which formats it correctly, and then insert that context variable into your file get contents call as the third argument. And then it'll send those headers and any other headers you need to insert, like API token or other stuff, along with your request. Oh, question?
What's the second parameter? I can't remember.
Oh,
It's false there.
I can't remember off the top of my head either.
I just did.
It's clearly not super important, but yeah, I think it might be something related to how you want the content returned.
Yeah, that's a pretty simple thing to look up.
Yeah.
I never remember.
I look up function calls like 20 times a day.
Yeah.
It's use include path.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I don't know what that means.
I think it has something to do with like pathing on like a local server or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, so in that case, and I was actually going to swing over to, one second, I'm just going to exit the presentation because I wanted to demo something real quick. Here we go. Okay, so now you can see I have a little file editor open right here, and this is basically doing a very simple API call to the Trello API. So in this case, there's basically a URL string with a bunch of URL parameters tacked on at the end to form a GET request that I'm passing to file get contents. So basically the simplest form of doing a kind of API call. Outputting the results into a variable, and then right now I'm just printing the what we have there. So doing this with multiple, I'm just gonna show my entire screen. Okay, that's easier. So this is what it outputs, which is this big long string of a bunch of weird data that tells you a bunch of stuff about the Trello boards that I have as a person. It doesn't look very nice right now, and this is just like a big string bob. So what we can do instead is if we go back here, once we run the results of the file get contents through JSON to code, save it, and then refresh the page, then you can see the print R statement is outputting it as a PHP array. So we can iterate over that and do, like for example, if I wanted to say print the name of every board, then what I would do is loop over that array and just do like this arrow name, and echo that. Let's get back to that. Okay, back to presenting. No. Okay, so if we want to start creating our own APIs, where do we begin? So I'm going to talk a little bit about prototyping, which is a way to basically set up an API really fast in a really simple way. So if you have, like, say, a big spreadsheet or a CSV or something like that, but you're like, okay, I need to do something with this really fast. I don't have time to just DIY an application from scratch. Like if you wanted to say, like, build some interactive charts or transform it in some way on a website for someone else to see, like if you have a project deliverable or something like that. There are a handful of really cool tools online. Google Sheets actually has its own API, so you can sort of prototype your own database just from by importing a spreadsheet and then hooking into that with the Google Sheets API. It has a bunch of good documentation on the Google developer website. Airtable is actually a personal favorite of mine. I used to run my personal website off of Airtable before it just got a little bit too unwieldy to not use the proper CMS. Before that, I actually ran my personal website off of Trello, which that was well, it wasn't necessarily the best thing I could have done for performance, but it sure worked. And an Airtable is a hosted database application. Basically, it has a big table interface that allows API access and basically allows you to generate your own document. It auto-generates documentation for each database that you make in Airtable so that you can sort of look up, okay, how do I select based on this kind of information, and then return that to my website or whatever. So those are two tools that you can do to basically create a database application really fast. I hear the serverless thing is really on trend these days. I didn't actually know what serverless was until someone told me that I'd just been doing it for a really long time. But basically that is a way you could get a serverless application more or less up and running just by using, because you can hit those APIs with JavaScript if you want, or you can build a PHP application around it, or any other language for that matter. Next steps of building your own API and doing something from scratch. So it's actually really, really easy, provided that you already have a database with data that you want to expose to people. So some things that that are great about having an API, can get people to engage with your application. If people can sort of transform the data or display it in an interesting way, like if people want to, say, be able to just, type something and be able to get the weather from the command line, or have a little widget on their desktop that displays current information from your website, stuff like that. That's a great way to get user engagement with a production application. You may actually want to access some of your data asynchronously from within the application, like what I mentioned before with loading more posts asynchronously on the page. And also, APIs are great for building mobile apps, because then you can pull in data from a website without having to build any kind of syncing apparatus to sync data to a phone application from a website. It can just all run off the same database. So what you need is basically a database of information that you want to access in whole or in part and expose to users, as well as a publicly accessible PHP or other web server-y file that you can put requests to, and that's basically it. You can do, you can make it more complicated, obviously, but that's basically all you need to start with. So the first thing that you need to do is basically we want to be sending our response as JSON. So what we're going to do is start by sending a header in your PHP file. So this will tell the browser what content type to expect, and also any servers that are receiving it. So in this case, we're sending content type application/JSON. The casing is important, and you just put that at the very, very beginning before you start actually printing any content. Because it's telling the browser what is coming next. Then what we're going to do is return the JSON. If you have data that can be, that in PHP is an array or an object of some kind, then you can, or I think basically you can put anything but a request object into JSON encode. So that basically takes whatever you give it and turns it into a JSON object. The better your data is formatted, obviously, the more useful it's going to be when it comes out the other side, because it doesn't really do anything else to it. And then what we're going to do with what's returned there is echo that directly after the header, which will basically give you a JSON document to give to people. If your content isn't conveniently available in that form, you can also manually format it. JSON can get a little bit fussy about white space and needing to do things like escape quotes because because everything is supposed to be wrapped in a string. So if you have quotes inside quotes, then it gets very angry. So if you have bugs at this step, that's probably it. I've done so much debugging of huge JSON documents trying to figure out the one place where someone inserted a quote that they weren't supposed to. Yeah, and then obviously that's kind of a long link, but if you go to, say, like the JSON page in Wikipedia, it has a bunch of the standardized guidelines on the formatting requirements for something to be properly interpreted that way. So if you want to get fancy and do something like issue API keys for your tiny baby lovely application, so each key should be unique because it's basically a unique identifier of who's using your application, and you don't want someone to be able to put in an API key and be like, oh, what happens if I change the user ID and get back a bunch of private data. So generally, if you have user records, say account storage, you would want to store the keys in the user records and query those for a match to determine which user is currently using your application. So basically, it's sort of like a username password combo. You can do this you can issue these keys manually if it's a small application and it's you using it or 5 of your friends. Or if you have some account creation script, you can generate those as some kind of hash in your preferred hash format on account creation. And also a good thing to know is that you should be able to ideally issue a new one, whether that's again manually or automatically. It's kind of like a password, and it is basically a password because it does secure a bunch of important user data. So if someone's like, hey, I accidentally let someone get a hold of my API key, or whoops, I accidentally committed it to a public open source GitHub repository, can you issue me a new one? You should be able to do that if you are, in fact, securing data that you're returning via an API. And then, which sort of brings us to a further fun topic, which is making APIs for other people's stuff. So there's a lot of big tech companies that have recently deprecated their APIs, some with very rude amounts of not much warning. So why do they keep doing that? Some of that is because to force traffic into their own channels. If they have an official app, generally they want people to be using it and not paying money to, say, Tweetbot to provide a better Twitter user interface that they can't. Also, it prevents users from getting around ad traffic, because if someone builds a client that uses their API, that's we're just going to display the main feed and no ads, then that sort of cuts into their revenue. And also some companies have shut down a lot of their API stuff in response to security holes being discovered. I think Instagram being one of them. I know some people who worked at Sprout Social when that happened, and they were all really unhappy. I'm just going to close something real quick. Get back to, where is my window? There we go. In this context, if you really need to get some data from a website that doesn't provide an API, you might consider web scraping. So we can actually do this with file get contents as well, which is another use for the big string of HTML that it returns when you point it to not a JSON document. So it gets the content of an HTML page and generally allows you to parse it as a series of XML nodes. So an HTML page is basically just a document that's sort of like a tree of nodes that are nested within each other, which is what we're navigating when we use stuff like the document object model in JavaScript. So PHP classes such as DOM document can help you navigate those. I think DOM document might actually be built in to the PHP distro, if I recall correctly, and that can help you navigate through those nodes and sort of dig down to the content that you want. So if you're I want to pull all the Instagram images from the last 9 posts on my home feed and put them on my website, then you can go okay, I found the image, I found the div tag that has the image as a data attribute on it, or a background image, and then I'm going to pull that and display it on my web page. So for one thing, this is not ideal. It's more laborious and a lot less reliable because those pages will change their layout, and sometimes there will be, so it's liable to break if you're not watching it super carefully. The other thing is more warnings. So this might be against the terms of service. You might void your warranty with the website. This also can be kind of rude if you're using up all the site's bandwidth by scraping their content, because that does generate a lot more like bandwidth use than just getting a very light document like a JSON file. So as a result, if you do this, just as a warning, you might get rate limited, or your script might get blocked, or if they can identify who's doing it, your account might get suspended. However, you don't want to do this in a production application or anything that a lot of people are going to be using. If you do have to do this for some reason, there are probably a number of sites where it's like it's not going to cause a huge problem, or it's like it's one of your old sites and you just need to extract some data from it despite the fact that you never built an API for it. A polite way to do it is use a cron job. Cron job is something that a computer does at specified intervals, basically. The cron table is a list of programs that we run at specified intervals. And basically you can have it run a script to fetch some data, like maybe every 4 times a day, every hour, once a day in the middle of the night or something like that, and use the scheduler to pull some data, import it to a database on your server, so you don't have to keep hitting their server every time the page loads, and then have a copy of that for your own site as it updates. And the formatting for the cron tab is kind of weird. There's a site called crontab.guru, which will sort of help you figure out how to format the time. But again, this is not an ideal solution. This is basically not a thing that you generally want to do for a production application. It can be a good way to transfer data from a legacy application to a front-end marketing website or something like that. If a site you're using that's a third-party thing that doesn't have a public API, you can consider getting in touch to ask if that's on the roadmap, or could be. A lot of developers, especially if you're paying for their services in some way, are often very excited to help out with that kind of thing. And also, if it's an open source project, consider learning the ropes, putting in a pull request, and helping them add API support.
There's this cool tool I found I was going to mention called Wrap API.
Oh yeah.
It's free and it basically does that part of scraping the DOM or whatever, but it's pretty handy if you want to save yourself some time.
Oh nice. Yeah.
What's it called?
WrapAPI.com. W-R-A-P. Yeah, and I think they cache it a little bit, so it's not quite as painful for the site owners, but it still runs into the same problems of you're probably breaking the terms of service. Yeah. Probably not a great thing to do at scale, but here and there, maybe.
Yeah. It's I know we I've seen some relatively creative solutions to not being able to really fully use the Twitter and Instagram APIs anymore and stuff like that. So. Yeah.
Netflix did that too.
Yeah.
Netflix did.
Oh yeah. Well, so that's sort of my very sort of quick run through of a very big topic. So go forth and build things. As I said, I am Carly Ho. You can find me on the internet, Twitter, Carly M Ho. On Mastodon, if you're on Mastodon, I am carly@kitty.town. And my website is carlymho.com. Thank you again for visiting us here at Clip Studios. Does anyone have any questions? No? Does anyone have any fun ideas about what to do with APIs?
Go ahead.
Here?
Have you ever chose to use file get contents over curl? I actually didn't realize, I didn't think about using file get contents. I feel like it would just make it easier, but I don't know if there's any downsides.
Yeah, it's actually funny because I only realized that you could just use file get contents for that recently, because when I was running my own website off of weird API stuff that I built for funsies, I was mostly using curl to ping the API after I realized that JavaScript I was having to like do 30 API calls as to like 3 that I was having to do with PHP. But yeah, I don't 100%, I couldn't like figure out if there was any kind of downside performance-wise between the two of them. Like it wouldn't surprise me if curl had slightly better performance just because I think it's pretty much a straight wrapper around the command line application. But on the other hand, it's sort of like it's kind of like a toss-up on modern computing hardware.
Yeah. Can they both stream responses as well? Do you know?
That's a good question. I think curl might be your better option if you're trying to stream stuff.
Kills more options.
Right.
Yeah,
So like
because curl is like a little more
if you're
granular.
getting really big pages, then streaming will save you a lot of RAM versus going and getting the whole context. Yeah. But that doesn't apply in most cases.
But yeah,
that's like
if you're just trying to get like I don't know, like the 30 items in my Airtable database of like my portfolio, then it's not a huge deal. But yeah, if I was trying to like query a huge database, then yeah, that makes sense.
Cool, thanks.
I was actually going to ask a similar question, like, does anybody know the advantage to using, like, I've always used Guzzle, which is a wrapper, I think, around curl, if I'm not mistaken. But
yeah, there's a lot of options.
I don't know why I use it. I just
yeah.
got in the habit. I like it.
I mean, there's a lot of things where it's like you just end up using whatever you first learned to use and comes most easily, which for a lot of like, if you just want to build a thing, then it's like whatever's going to get the thing built is often the best choice for getting it off the ground. You can change it later if you're like, this has bad performance issues, but
if I wanted to publish an API myself, you showed a 3 or 4 line example of that. Are there frameworks, like PHP frameworks for doing that kind of operation for a variety of requests?
okay, like to build your own API, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually. So I think, if I recall correctly, it's called Lumen, which is sort of an offshoot of the Laravel project. Laravel is sort of like an MVC, model view controller framework for PHP, similar to like say Rails or what is the name of the Python one? Django, yeah. For some reason, I keep getting that mixed up with Drupal. But yeah, Lumen is like a very stripped down framework that's basically for setting up Git and post handlers for different URL endpoints. So basically, it's really ideal for like if you're setting up microservices, or if you just want to like, or if you're doing like a mostly API-based application that you want a front end with, like say a JavaScript front end, or like send data to like a mobile application. So it's similar to like say Sinatra and Ruby or Flask in Python, where it's basically at its core, it's just like you set up like a bunch of tiny functions that are just handlers for certain URL patterns, and then return something. So you can sort of use it as like a tiny web server, or you can just return stuff like database information.
Slim PHP is pretty popular as well.
Nice.
Very similar similar project.
Slim?
Yeah, it's called Slim PHP. Just another option. They both do really, I think, the same thing.
Yeah, I think there's like a growing number of those kind of applications because like just having like a really tiny lightweight framework is really like in demand right now. I get the impression.
It's kind of inspired by Express for Node.
Yeah.
Which is very lightweight.
My question though would be, how much longer is Lumen going to be around? Because I saw Taylor tweet something. Well, they're going to add a new feature in PHP where they're talking about like preloading stuff.
Huh.
And so, I don't know, Taylor put out a tweet something about like how quick like the Hello World Laravel application would be compared to like a Lumen application. So
yeah. But you can do everything that you do in Lumen in Laravel.
Yeah.
You just end up
there's a lot more
packages
stuff.
a bunch of extra stuff in, and so it technically might be slower in some cases. But for practical purposes, I mean, I just
Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you.
Yeah,
Nice.
thanks.
Yeah, and I can post the slides to the meetup or something like that.
Yeah, sounds good.
We'll figure out what to do with the video.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll.
YouTube, I don't know.
Yeah, this would be great to start a